So tonight I wanted to welcome Conor Fahy. Conor is known to most of you. He's based in Ballyvaughan, but he's originally from New Quay. I had the privilege of living in Finavara myself for a few years, and it's just an amazing place with some amazing people, including your own father, Conor, who's an extraordinary man. Conor is an engineer, again like myself, but I think you've gotten out of the engineering now, Conor, same as myself as well. And I'm a person who's passionate about the Burn and particularly the history of the Burn. You know Conor as well from his B&B over in Ballyvaughan, I think many of you. So I'd like to welcome Conor, who was fantastic on the radio this morning by all accounts, to talk about Finavarra Lobster Pond. Conor, over to you.
Welcome to all of you, and thank you for coming out.
Nice and close to you.
How many of you have eaten lobster in the last month? Hands up. So it's a delicacy. And again, for a lot of you, that's the colour of lobster. Well, if you were to fish for them, they're black. My name is Conor, and Brendan has given you the details on that there. So essentially, I lived on the Martello Tower part of the Finavara Peninsula. So I spent my life looking down on this pond, and you know, I was constantly asking these simple questions here. When was it built? What was its business model? And how did such an enterprise like this fit into the west coast of Ireland? Sorry. Now, so just to go over where exactly it is, you see Finavara there, Blackhead, straight in Finavara. So that's that peninsula there, right? Ottenish is the next one out. And we concern ourselves with the estuary that goes up to Bell Harbour. Okay? So on Google Maps, this is that black lump there, that's 40 acres in size. And this is the controlled water that made up the lobster pond that was essentially driven by an English family for about 50 or 60 years. So as I said, lobster is definitely a delicacy today. Go back 300 years, if you live near the shore, you could scavenge for practically free and you could eat it every day. Oysters the same way. 300-400 years ago, almost everybody by the shore would eat oysters, but it's a delicacy today. Now the thing about lobster is, there's fresh fish and there's fresh fish, but this guy's got to be alive. You cannot cook dead lobster because the bacteria and the toxins that will be emitted are very likely to give you a food poisoning. Now, most of the west of Ireland, post-famine Ireland, lots of them could fish. They had the technology, they had the wherewithal in many cases, but there's not much point if your neighbour hasn't got the price of it, you know. So people living in Finavara, they had scavenged through the famine, they had got fish, but could they make a living out of it? No. Could they feed Galway? Yeah, practically they could, except Claddagh has already got 500 fishermen in there. They've got that market sewn up. And this was typically the story up and down through Mayo and everywhere. Lots of fish in the sea. You know, why did we starve in the famine? There's a big story about a guy standing on the top of Achill looking around at all that fish, and he looking at all these starving people, why won't they eat them? It's amazing actually how that relationship doesn't quite work, you know. But in 1844, the Devon Commission was set up, and it was about land use in Ireland. Very, very interesting that it happened before the famine. And it's interesting if you follow the findings of that. But in the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, Lord Carlisle, set up another commission under Thomas Semmond. And this is a very interesting government policy document. It was over a number of years, but he got going on the writing up of the document in 54, and it's published in 55. First thing he recognised is, west of Ireland and Ireland in general has got superior fisheries than they had in England. He also recognised, obviously, that the infrastructure was very weak in the west of Ireland. Our ports, our boats, our piers and so on. He also recognised for fresh fish, I mean, again, it was the same logic. Want to sell fish here, the English needed more fish than they were getting at the moment. And sure enough, the railway could become a major source, or a major fix to the problem that was fresh fish. The cost of the crossing, he highlighted as a major issue. So with the railways are kicked off, the Galway-Dublin connection, 1844, but to get it to Dublin is only half the battle, if even that. He also recognised that the West of Ireland had the personnel to do the work. He particularly highlighted the Claddagh people. He was very drawn to Galway. He recognised that the island people were great, not just fishermen, but great boatmen. Now, he said they were great boatmen. He also recognised that there wasn't a solitary trawler in the whole of the West of Ireland at that time, and it was already commonplace in England. This is one place where he came across Scovell. Scovell, we'll talk about him later, but this guy had been fishing out of Southampton, and he got his boat to go as far as Wexford and Waterford for lobsters, got as far as Baltimore, loads of fishermen, not a solitary lobster pot. So he gave them pots for nothing in 1855, and, well, not for nothing, sorry, interest-free, and they paid off the debt in lobsters, and it was very successful. He also dealt with Richard Scovell and uncovered that Richard Scovell was fantastic on expertise. There was at the time a massive... there was another initiative basically where they were studying how the Aussies could feed themselves within Australia and how they could feed others in the Commonwealth. And in looking at that, they were basically looking at food we have up here, like the way they brought camels to Australia for pack animals. Well, they were looking at bringing lobsters down there. They had their own crayfish, they had lobsters. But anyway, Scovell was the man to go to find out that you couldn't bring lobsters to Australia alive. And I'll talk about that a little bit more shortly. In one of his letters, he went back to the government. He didn't cost it or anything, but he said, to kick it off, we need 30,000 in the West of Ireland to get this up and running. And he was very clear, West of Ireland meant semi-state companies set up in Galway. He was really drawn to that concept. But like a lot of these things, it had to be paid for, and he didn't have any problem funding it as such, but he needed the British government to underwrite it. In other words, he expected it wouldn't get paid off. You know? And he highlighted again the crossing cost. On the Devon Commission, we look at the follow-up on that. Again, it was English-centred, and we look at the basically the way the Incumbents to States Act was put through, and we look at a lot of these government policies. But in the case of the fish, he got widespread support for it. One of the cynics at that time would have been what's his face, Frederick Ingalls, the guy with Marx. And he looked at the English administration in Ireland, and he basically recognised that the English was a very centralised system, very centralised. And they looked in Ireland as an agricultural district. And simply, Ireland was to supply them with corn, cattle, wool, and recruits for the military and industry. It's as simple as that. And this is probably damn correct, really. But he also recognised that once he would put in place a policy that would interfere with the interests of the House of Lords, it probably would fail. And so he really garnished a lot of support for this, and he got 80 of the top fishmongers, fish merchants, fishermen to sign up to the deal. And John Scovell was among those 80. And from that point on, I think John Scovell was looking to the West of Ireland. And he got it signed off. Now, there was a decree from King Edward back in the 1300s, even before the Black Death, I guess. But essentially they recognised you can't just higgledy-piggledy have people selling fish anywhere around London. And they decreed that there would be one place, basically like Moore Street for fruit, one place in London, and that was Billingsgate. And Scovell had the lobster's licence for Billingsgate. Incidentally, we keep talking here around 1850. 1850, they took Billingsgate from being an outdoor market. They essentially, galvanised the roof or brought in an indoor market, and they had to rebuild it again, such was the growth, by 1873. So this is sometime in that time from the 1850s or 60s. London was only 76 miles away from Scovell's place by train. Okay, and in 1850, there's the figure: 1,200,000 lobsters. It's about 2,400 a day, and Scovell was the major player in that, the Scovell family. Okay, we'll just have a look at when I say Scovell, who I'm talking about. Basically, John is key to our story here. His brother, his older brother Robert was born 1820, also a fish merchant by the census, and his older brother again in the fish business. but his father, Richard, born in 1896. I happen to know that they originally come out of the Isle of Wight. I'm not quite sure when, but he was clearly the long-time expert when it comes to lobsters. Now, lobsters wasn't by any means their only speciality. They were also in the oyster business, and they shared that with the Warners. They were also another Southampton-based family, and they had significant interest in oysters. They also did the crabs and the crayfish just as much. But so when you hear me talking about lobsters here for the day, it's a mix of crabs and crayfish as well. But the money was in the lobsters. As far as oysters are concerned, with their success or failure, in the 1870s their beds were ravaged by disease, and the Warner end of the business bought out the Scovilles. That's in one account from the Department of Fisheries. I'm sure it's correct. No, we'll see. Here's Southampton. So this is where the Scovilles come to. You'll see, I don't know, should I walk away from this? Hamel on rice there on the right hand side, I'll be calling it Hamel, it's the same place. And essentially what you have is, they call it where the three rivers meet in Southampton. And they're rushing out to the sea, and they meet an island and they break it. Very similar, in fact, to where Finavara is. We've got the Scannons Island up along the estuary to Bell Harbour. That's an overground river. We got loads of underground streams coming in. So it's that mix of fresh water, seawater, mud flaps that makes it such a good bed for oysters. And unlike the ones we have here, they're sort of 20 acres in size. Now, I was talking about Richard being asked how to get lobsters to Australia. And this is called a smack. It's a boat that's even bigger than a hooker and lots of capacity to store stuff. It's a sailboat, and unlike a hooker with two sails, I think a hooker is two, but this has 5 usually of the various sizes. So it's a very large sailboat. And this one here would be typically for cod. And the thing about fishing is you can go out and fish around Southampton for a while, and the fish have moved on. So you end up following the fish. That was order of the day. And usually with a boat like that, that might run up to Iceland, quickly get a whole lot of fish, fill it up into your fish pond, your little onboard tank. See it in the middle? And that keeps it fresh. Not just fresh, alive. You bring it to London, you bring it to Scotland, you bring it wherever you want to bring it. And you offload your fish. But they were kept on an onboard tank. But, like your aquarium at home, it needs constant air. These guys were plumbed to the sea outside. So as the sailboat's driving through the water, the salt water has been taken in, mixed with the seawater inside, purged out the other side, so you're constantly aerating it. Your fish stay reasonably happy. Okay? Well, if they knew where they were going, they mightn't be so happy. Right. Now, in the case of the lobster equivalent, that's no good, because that's more like your goldfish bowl. The lobsters can't be stacked, so these are a much flatter operation. So it made that design more tricky. And interesting to note, John Scovell, the guy you keep coming back to, he's not just a fisherman, he's a fish merchant and shipbuilder. And so was Richard, his father, very good on the other hardware that's required for this enterprise. Now, most of you that ate the lobster in the last month, or maybe whenever you ate a lobster last, think about it, you probably ate a teenager. So a lobster that's about a pound weight is typically 11 plus years, right? It's 11 years per pound. So the typical lobsters you're getting in the restaurant, 1, 2, 3 pounds. Maybe if nobody fished lobsters for the next 40 years, they'd all be 44, 50 years of age, 4 and 5 pound lobsters. But that's a pretty accurate account. So that's a major factor here. Unlike oysters, unlike salmon, you can't decide you want farming lobsters. That's not to say you shouldn't try. And back here, we're talking in the Darwin era, biology of salmon was order of the day at the time. Biology of lobsters are being studied as well. 11 years per pound. Nevertheless, we mightn't want to farm them, but we do really need to store them. Because in the case of Scovell, right, he's operating in Southampton. Getting fish in the sea is a precarious enough job at best. Fishermen can't go out in storms to go lift in their pots. They might, the lobster is more likely to outlive the fisherman. And so there's a very irregular supply. So in order to rationalise that so you can maximise your return for your investment, you want to be able to supply the lobsters at the rate they want to eat them. So storage is critical. I'm talking without my notes here now. I think at this point, well, as I said, Richard is the head of the family here, he's the smart guy who figured out how to deal with storage. At the time, Scotland had developed big oak boxes. I'm not sure, they're probably in Canada and Maine as well. But essentially, it was a big oak box. It would be 10 foot by 10 foot or 15 by 15 or 12 by 12, 2.5 foot tall. And that then would float in the water, big open door on top, and loads of holes around the sides. And just floats in the water and just fill it up with your lobsters. But that's not good enough for the buyers of Southampton, because it's not enough. 2,400 a day, one of these is carrying 1,000. Need 3 boxes, that's only one day covered. So Richard decides to design a concrete version, if you like. Well, concrete floor, brick walls, 14 foot deep, well, 10 to 14 it's sliding, and it's 50 square yards. In fact, it was a heart shape, but we'll say for the purposes of this, it was that kind of size. And in it, he could store 80,000 lobsters. So essentially, per foot, you might have 2 or 3 per foot of that order anyway. So these guys, now the other thing that's amazing about lobsters is they didn't need to be fed. And you'd say, well, why not feed them? Yeah, it's a good idea, you could feed them, but if you throw in obviously they go for bait in a pot. So if we throw in a piece of cod or throw in some waste dogfish or something, they'll fight each other for it and kill each other for it. So they're actually animals that are designed to basically live on their own, relatively speaking. Reproduction is by the millions. After that's done, they kind of, generally speaking, live apart. Except lobsters need to grow, and their shell won't grow. So they discard their shell, kick off their Wellingtons, if you like, lose the top, and they grow a new shell outside the meat that's on them. And so that's called the molting process. And while that's going on, the cock will actually mine the hen. But it's a random thing. So they'll find them on the shore and so on. So in captivity, there's a problem. The lobsters will not shed, so they wouldn't grow anyway. But that's probably a benefit. If they did, they'd be instantly damaged by the others. So they found this storage does work in Sparta. But the amazing thing is you can keep them for 11 months and they don't have to eat. Maybe they'll have enough plankton, but they're not eating fish and they can sustain themselves. And that's why they don't change their shell. So we've discussed the corals there. That's the timber box version. So here's Richard's Pond, and I say it's 50k capacity there. Now, sorry. Now, one thing that is clear, the Scofields certainly understood their business. I don't need that one up actually, I might have to go back one. Their first port of call was that they were buying Cornish lobsters way back, and when the supply was maybe less, it was centred in Cornwall. They got very good at that. Then they started buying French lobsters. They didn't enjoy dealing with the French, but they bought lobsters from them. And then they preferred to deal with the Norwegians. They had better lobsters, but further away, and they got sorted with that. Then they came to Ireland, and I spoke about they got as far as Baltimore because that's as far as the ship would go. Now, the Cornish guys back in the 1860s, these guys highlighted to them, well, guess what? You're no longer giving us the bigger lobster. Why? Well, that's what's coming in the pots. Why? Simply, they'd overfish them. The lobsters weren't getting past. So they implemented a gauge that they wouldn't buy lobsters any smaller than 8 inches. But the Cornish guys didn't agree. There was 4 guys buying Cornish lobsters. They would give the Scofields the one over 8, and they were selling the others. And that was kind of indicative, or that kind of told the Scofield people, you got to be looking somewhere else. So that there again another reason to consider their options. And this is where Ireland became more into the frame. Except that, if you want to get lobsters from further afield, they were getting as far as Baltimore on a few days and back with these sail ships. And the sail ships rely on the wind. Problem is the lobster on these smack boats will last only 8 days in summer and 8 days in winter. 8 days in summer, 11 days in winter. Now that was critical. So that meant they could get to Baltimore, certainly. They could get around to Kerry maybe, but they certainly couldn't get to Galway. So again, they were looking at the west of Ireland, and they realised there's a different way of doing it. And this Sigmund report is telling them the railway may be the answer. And this is where we get to Finavara. What they had to do when they checked it out, I said that there are similarities to Southampton. They certainly had information. They certainly decided to look to Finavara. Now, in order that they would have their system, they didn't need it this big, but this was available to them. And what they wanted to do is, see here in the front, if you consider this is the mouth of the estuary, well, there's two mouths. There's this one, and there's the other road, the Ballyvaughan side. By shutting this off, in fact, they completely wanted to dam this off, control all that 40 acres of water, and that was their first port of call, right? So they now had control of 40 acres of water, and that wall is this order of dam. Okay, what you're looking at there, at the deepest point, that's 25 foot deep. On the base, it's 20 foot across, bigger than a regular road. On top, it's 8 foot wide. It's a very big quay, if nothing else. But in fact, it was originally designed largely as a dam. On the other side, see the two arches? That was to release the water. These were blocked off with cages. There was a timber frame within that, and it was well caged. In the middle, you have, I don't know if we can see. No, we can't. This is the tide coming in now. But we look at these 2 points here. There is big round barrels, if you like, but they're actually tubes. They were actually used on ship liners as ballast, and they would be filled up with water as needed. But in the shipwreck, Scovell got his hands on them, and each side there you had access to let water out, so you could drain the pond fully with those open. And in the middle you had a relatively small opening, nothing like that. So in high tide, that tide would get out. The reason you don't want it is so the lobsters will obviously escape. So you need the smaller you could manage with that hole, the more control you had, and you'd easily lose a lot of your lobsters otherwise. This pond here in front is part of the story as well. This is where they would do grading and so on. And see here, this would have been fully covered in galvanized wire, so your lobsters were contained within it. Now on the other side, we've got two walls, not one. This one and this one. The outer one, see this here? Right. That wall there is made of loose stone, unlike the other was built of concrete. And that loose stone was 6 foot tall, 14 foot wide, and 4 foot at the high tide mark. And that was actually built by the Skirts. And that was built even before 1840. Its only purpose was access to the island at high tide. Cows never walk across it. It's far too loose rock, but you could get on and off as humans want to go in and till lands or whatever. Now, this second wall, on the other hand, this was meant to be a full wall to contain lobsters. So, and there's all the lobster activities going back on the other side of the pond, but they were constantly escaping and all that, and they didn't mind because they had control of them as far as they were concerned. But the top of that wall, even when I was young, it was very clear that there was 4 poles in the middle and poles up here, and it was fully fenced off with a very thick gauge wire, galvanized. And there was one hole through to let out the water, and over the wall was the usual way out. So there again we see the dam, okay, and the house there in the middle. That house back in 1840 by the map didn't exist, but we believe that this is the Griffiths listed 1855 house that is called the boathouse for the Scovilles. And at that time it does have all of the characteristics of a boathouse for sure. It subsequently became a store for the Scovell project and went on to become a residence. And I'd say it's mixed between store and residence for all of its life. Certainly by 1920 it was the permanent accommodation for the key staff in the enterprise outside of the Scovilles, and that was Joe and Annie Cairns, and they lived in that all of their lives from when they got married in 1920. Now, see that tidal condition I showed you different photographs earlier? The steps down along, essentially, you wanted boats to come on there. They didn't want to be checking when it's high tide or otherwise, but the boats could come at various platforms and pull in, and the lobsters were tossed in over the wall. At the time, it was a full dam, so you couldn't go inside, but you would throw them into a corridor inside, and then they would be graded from there. So there is talks that the Skerritts built the pond. There's no evidence that they did. I'd say that wall is probably the only part that had any contribution to it. But they certainly had no expertise in fisheries. They had one son, an engineer. He certainly didn't have anything to do with it, and he died young like the rest of them. But he was in England when this was going on, and as a very young engineer. In 1877, the Warners are back in the Scovell story. They had bought them out of the oyster business. But thanks to Dennis Moore, the current owner, he confirmed to me last night that in fact Skerritt did lease the pond to John Scovell and Thomas Warner for a 50-year lease, all of the pond we were talking about, for £44 annually. Not absolutely sure it's annually, but I don't think it's for 50 years. But so we guess it's 44 annually. We're talking about the boathouse there. That the boathouse in the store was belonged to Joe and Annie Cairns for a finish. Okay, so now let's talk about. We know that the pond is there. In fact, the pond is referenced every year, it seems, in the Department of Fisheries report as an exemplary project, and they had notions that they should do oysters there. They had notions that, in fact, yes, it should be a fattening house for lobsters, because over in Maine and Canada, they were doing stuff as a nursery. So basically you could get a lobster breed, you have the right ponds, pools, and you can get 1 million little lobsters. But I mean, turning them into big lobsters is a different matter. You let them off to the sea, whatever. But so they were looking at it that way. But they were also talking at the time, trawling is becoming bigger and bigger and bigger. And they were catching, say, plaice and cod, and they were saying, well, that would be the perfect environment for them. So rather than throw them back when they were small, because they're not going to sell them, you could put them into here. But again, the Scovilles never bought into that. In 1877, I reckon it's the peak of the Scovell business. Now, because we definitely have John in the game. I reckon Richard is already dead. Robert is definitely in the game. And Richard Jr., we call him. But they had 6 smacks. So I reckon that was, based on the kind of quantities we were talking about earlier on, it was about 20 or 30,000 a week. I don't know if they go out every week, but it was potentially that. So it's a hell of a lot of lobsters. And again, if you're looking back to that 12 million figure, it had probably only grown through a big scale alone. Another thing that they were doing at that time that started, in order that you could put in your thousands of lobsters into this artificial environment, they would eat each other if you put them in. Not that they normally would eat each other, but if you put them into captivity like this, they would. So what they were doing was, like you would open an oyster, they would cut the craw, the ligament here. But they found that they didn't thrive and they weren't healthy, and sometime after that they discovered that they'd better go for the rubber band. So a lot of you will be familiar with the lobsters, and they're wearing this rubber band so they don't bite the human or their neighbours. That's the other side of it, of course. The lobsters had to get to the train. So horses and jarvey were essential, that when you get quite large volumes obviously going out here, and so there was a constant delivery, horse and cart to Oranmore to meet up at the train. Quite clearly, right from the beginning, Finavara's gain was Hamill's loss, because originally when they were using the smacks to transport the boats, they were going to Southampton. They were getting depoted there and on to Southampton. Now they're going straight across to Holyhead and straight to London. Again, it seems from the offset by the Department of Fisheries, this was clearly been received as working. That the idea of a hub and the idea of storage was working. Looks like William is taken over from John from the late 80s. This is quite clear. I don't know if I'm going to deal with that later. I think I will. Okay. Right. John retires in 90, has retired by 91 for sure. But either he or a nephew, John, started getting, if any know yachting, Luke Yachting, out of Southampton, but they were very, very big in the past. They were quite young at the time, and he went in with them on that plan. So he's out of the game, while William is now taken over from the late 1980s, or 1880s, sorry. In 1993, we know that he's become Irish to some extent because he's featured in the Guys directory for UK, and he's in the directory there as a fish merchant. The boat that was previously called Margaret was in John's name, but it's gone by William's name from 86. William takes out a lease in Stormy Hall. If you recognise that house, it's on Flaggy Shore. And he took a lease on that from 94 for 7 years. But by 2001, he's staying with the in-laws. We also see that the French and Norwegian ports are both closed. So they're obviously getting enough cheap lobsters in the west of Ireland rather than have to buy the French ones. And the Norwegian ones, they lost one boat back in the late 70s. And their second one now, their larger one, was actually tied up because there's too much maintenance issues with it. Cornwall, definitely overfished. So that's what I'm saying. People talk about the famine. Why don't you go? Well, you can go out and fish off Achill like Ryan Chew was saying, but you keep fishing there for a couple of years and it goes down quickly. Stanley, the son of William, was born in 1896. And then John Scovell dies in 1900, sorry. He's 78 at this point, right? The confirmation I have on this is basically the will being, and it was William and Lydia, his daughter, that were the, the executives. Now, this is interesting. In 1900, John dies. It seems there's a bit of a dispute over the will. Well, not necessarily a dispute, but there seems to be a review or a re-planning the whole thing up again. And he's absent for a couple of years. The Department of Fisheries are busy because they've actually recognised there's a major problem with oyster supply. Basically, Bindon had been down in Cornroo, had been very successful with the famine. That died. The Scots took it over in the 1870s. That was a failure. Paul Doody was gone, and Muckinish was the last one that was busy. But they were now gone as well. And the Department of Fisheries took it upon themselves to try and figure out if they could get Muckinish back up and going. You know what I'm talking about? It's the mud flaps around the castle there. So they did about 3 or 4 sites. And I'll show you a picture later of a second pond. But there's a pond adjacent to Scovell's pond. And they actually successfully got lobsters cultivated there. And they wanted Scovell to take it over from them. I think Scovell had developed a distaste for oysters at that point and turned it down in 2003. Another thing that happened in 2003, and it's interesting when I checked this out, we all know about the big wind in 1839, historically speaking anyway, but the next massive event in storms was, it's featured in Ulysses as well, was 1903, February 1903. Something like 3,000 trees down in Phoenix Park is one measure of it. But it was not just the wind, it was the rain. And all that rain burst through the oak that was in the middle of the dam. So it enlarged it quite considerably. So the dam now got adapted to the pictures I showed you there. So they now had needed more wire. They decided, probably, it seems to me, that they wanted access for the boats to come in and out maybe. That the dam before maybe was too far from where they were working. So they had a somewhat newer scheme. In 2003, we see John's Irish assets were all transferred to William. I did speak to the last of the Scovells about this, and there seems to be some level of bitterness about that. I'm not quite sure why that was, though. Now, by the middle of World War I, the government had taken over the Southampton estuary. And my reading of this is that the other cousins of William, who were busy, and they're listed as fishermen at these times, weren't that busy. And the government took it over. There was a torpedoed boat in Southampton. They took it over for military reasons. And when they were finished with it after the war, they gave it back, but it was from there on in leisure and leisure only. Now, I just mentioned that here's Scanlon's Island, and here is the other pond where the oysters were, and that's adjacent to the, So it was very well enclosed and very sheltered. And the real issue here was, because you've got a flush of rainwater or a flush of high tide and that, a lot of the spawn get washed out. This was very controlled now. And the dam was a large part of that. Now we just talk about a lot of the locals that were involved in it, right? Essentially, this is my part in it anyway. My great-grandfather was one of those Jarvies, and he pretty much probably had a full-time job for 2 or 3 decades, delivering the lobsters from the pond through to Oranmore. His sons, at least 2 of them, had, I don't know how much work, but they certainly were very busy with that activity as well. We had two stables, and that was probably the main reason why. Now there were others also, I'm sure, that were also doing that work, and that was back in the 80s and 90s. But I think if we moved on to maybe after World War I, we can talk about the kind of people that are in it. My father's older first cousins, the Jims, Bernard's here tonight, we'll call her one of them. There was at least Packy, one of the older sons. He certainly was there for several years, and the others were day jobs, and they were getting short-term work there quite frequently. We also had the Cairns. Joe was one guy, but his first cousin Johnny Lar was very busy in it. Bartley Cairns and his stepbrother, they would have been in and out of there a lot. Jamesy Holleran, a nephew of Joe Cairns, he was quite regular there as well. So it looks like typically we were talking 6-7 full-time workers, right? The kind of work they would have been doing was making the crates, making the barrels. Originally when they were doing it, they were shipping these in barrels. And I've looked at this up and down. The reason they were probably doing barrels, because they were talking about barrels of fish. And they started with barrels, and I guess it had a lot to do with, because of the irregularity of the steamboat and getting them on and off, they could probably add water to keep the lobsters more happy on the docks, But they did move to crates. So there was a full-time 13 lobsters per crate. And the lobsters back in 1880 were sustained in wet straw, wetted by seawater. And that was almost comatose them and sent them on their merry way. And 4 days, hopefully they're alive and well in the restaurant in London. By the time the 30s had come around, they'd gone to sawdust. So it's more dust. But again, it seems... I Googled it and I see lobsters are only supposed to stay alive for 2.5 or 36 hours. But that's what they were certainly doing. And I'm sure they weren't... Every lobster, they weren't arriving dead in London. I show this picture because legend has it, Scovell was living on the Flaggy Shore. He had a Hillman Hunter car in the 30s, but he'd never spend the diesel to go to work. Climb up over the mountain, walk into Finavara and wake up all of his staff and beat them down the hill to go to work. And I think that legend comes from the Jims in particular. But the real labour value here wasn't just Finavara. The real labour was outside of that. Like Joe, they used to go, the reason I said 2 or 3 decades for the Jarvies, they bought a Bedford truck. So they don't need any horses anymore. That's a big help because they can get to Oranmore quicker. But more important, they'd go to Oranmore and then they'd continue on to Clifton and work their way back and pick up all the lobsters. Right? So that was a big saving. But that still wasn't enough. They had a boat. Originally, the one I spoke of was called the Margaret. That was then replaced by the Alice Webster. And the Alice Webster was going up to Mayo, but it was usually based in the Aran Islands. And they didn't just bring lobsters, they brought a wife to Joe Cairns. And that was Annie Conley, and she did all the bookwork from 1920 on when he married her. And that's why she was, because Scovell didn't care for it apparently. And that's why they got the house. They were such critical guys. But again, the Alice Webster was manned. That was 4 or 5 guys from the Aran Islands in it. Okay? And of course they were probably fishing when they weren't doing that. And all the fishermen probably from Baltimore back up to Donegal. I say Donegal because in the 2011 census we know that William was staying above in a house in Killybegs for the night on that census. So you can be sure that they had a lot of control. And so that was a lot of additional work. So that kind of story is actually not untypical of today. What actually was going on here was England was, let's put it this way, right? These days we've got trawlers off the Irish coast, in and out of Killybegs every day. But who's on them? The staff are, for the most part, from low-cost countries, Philippines, Egypt, and so on. Well, this is what was going on here too, to some extent. A lot of this was the hard work that people weren't doing in England, probably, if they didn't have to. So it was the low-cost country that was Ireland, right? We had the additional cost of crossing Ireland, crossing the crossing the sea, and getting from Holyhead to London. So that was a big amount that was an extra burden, right? But we were the low-cost country. We were a lean operation. We were able to produce it cheaper. This was cheaper labour than they had in England, and that was why it was working at all. Okay, so that was that kind of thing. No idea where I am in my notes now, but anyway, I might as well forget it. So who's the cast in this story? Richard was the main guy for the expertise, born in 1796. Richard, as far as I can make out, had no kids, but he was certainly there and a player through the 1850s and 60s and 40s. Robert married Maria, did at least 3 children. John is our main guy initially. Now he's got a son, John, Richard, Betsy. William, who has a son, well, he's got Stanley, right? He marries, he didn't marry an Irish lady, so he obviously met this lady over. So he was coming and going a lot at the time. Charles, Rose. So that was the family, right? Stanley had actually, he was obviously living half Ireland, half England. Remember, if these lobsters are travelling over and back, these guys must have been travelling over and back nearly as much. But he grew up with an English attitude and very much an Englishman. But he also fought in the First World War. And for his sins, he got seriously injured. And so much so that he was 2 years well, he didn't come back to the 20s. And he was in hospital for a lot of that time. He married his nurse. But he never had any kids. But when I started doing this research and I started looking for who was who and everything, I found this most intriguing story about the last of the Mohicans. And she was the one who told me that Stanley, they never had much to do with him because they felt that maybe this vast, wealthy enterprise in the west coast of Ireland should have been maybe divided between the others. And they had this perception. But if it were the case, Stanley never bought out his own house until 1944. It was after his father had died, and his father had died in 1942. But there had initially thought that Stanley had died in the war. When I say they, the family in general. And this guy Charles, they were convinced he was dead in the war. Never showed up or divided or separated from the family. And eventually the descendants of Rose tells me this story, that on the death of William in 1942, Betsy had been living for many years, and probably 2 decades, in the house in Stormy Hall. And she was sent packing by Stanley in 1942. And she went after the lobsters to London. And she knocked on the door of her niece, Gertrude, whom she'd never seen in her life, in 1942 in the middle of the Great Blitz. And she lived another 17 years there. So, but that was one. And this Charles guy whom they thought he was dead, the descendants went to the father's grave back in the 50s or 60s only to find out somebody's dug up the grave to find out that in fact Charles had never died. But those last 2 of his sons are also childless now, so there are none of the Scovilles left. Okay, so that was it. Thank you very much.